I thought this would be just another routine vaccine appointment. The kind where Mason would cry, I'd feel guilty, and we'd leave with a lollipop and a band-aid. That's how it always went with doctors. But the moment I walked into that examination room and saw Doc Joseph Cole, something shifted in the air around me. He was crouched down at Mason's level, speaking so gently that I found myself leaning in just to catch the sound of his voice. It was warm, like honey dissolving in tea, and it wrapped around something inside my chest that I'd forgotten existed. "Hey there, little champ," Joseph said, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners. "You look pretty brave to me. Are you brave?" Mason, my shy 3-year-old who usually hid behind my leg when strangers approached, actually nodded. He nodded and then, God, I'll never forget this, he smiled. Not the polite smile he gave to grocery store clerks or the forced one for family photos. This was real, genuine, the kind of smile that lit up his whole face and made my heart squeeze painfully in my chest. I stood there frozen, watching this stranger work some kind of magic on my son. Joseph moved with such careful precision, explaining every step in a way that didn't talk down to Mason but didn't overwhelm him either. When he prepared the vaccine, he let Mason hold a small stuffed bear from the counter. "This is Buddy," Joseph explained. "He's been with me through lots of appointments. He's very brave. Can you be brave with him?" Mason clutched that bear like it was the most precious thing in the world and whispered, "I can be brave." My throat tightened. 3 years of single parenting, and I'd never seen Mason trust someone this quickly. Joseph's hands were steady as he administered the shot, his movements so smooth that Mason barely flinched. Instead of crying, my son just kept staring up at Joseph with something close to wonder in his eyes, like he'd just met a superhero. "You did amazing, Buddy," Joseph praised, and there was such genuine pride in his voice that it made me realize how rare that kind of authenticity was. Then he looked up at me, and suddenly I was the one being examined. Those brown eyes focused on me with an intensity that made me forget how to breathe properly. "Dad, you doing okay?" That's when I realized I'd been staring, just standing there like an idiot, watching him with what must have been the most obvious expression on my face. Heat flooded my cheeks immediately. "Why? Yeah, I'm fine," I stammered, trying to pull myself together. But I wasn't fine. Not even close. Something had just cracked open inside me, something I'd carefully sealed away after Mason's mother left, and I had no idea what to do with the feeling. Joseph handed Mason a sticker, a golden star that my son immediately pressed to his shirt with pride. "You were the bravest patient I've had all week," he told Mason, then glanced at me with a smile that made my stomach flip. "He's a great kid. You're doing something right." Those words hit me harder than they should have. 3 years of struggling alone, of wondering if I was enough, if Mason would grow up okay with just one parent who barely knew what he was doing, and the stranger had just validated all of it with one simple sentence. As we walked out of the clinic, Mason wouldn't stop talking. "Papa, did you see? I didn't cry. Dr. Joseph said I was brave. Can we come back and see him again?" I nodded absently, still processing what had just happened in that examination room. The afternoon sun was bright, almost blinding after the fluorescent lights inside, but I barely noticed. My mind kept replaying moments. The way Joseph's hands had been so gentle, the softness in his voice, that brief moment when our eyes met and the world seemed to pause. That night, after I'd given Mason dinner, supervised bath time, and read 3 bedtime stories because he was too excited to sleep, I finally sat down on my couch in the quiet apartment. The silence felt heavier than usual. I pulled out my phone and found myself searching for the clinic's information, saving the number with fingers that trembled slightly. It was ridiculous. I was being ridiculous. But I couldn't stop thinking about Joseph Cole, the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd made Mason feel safe, the way his presence had made me feel something other than tired and overwhelmed for the first time in years. I stared at the saved number for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. "Maybe I should schedule a follow-up," I whispered to the empty room, trying to convince myself it was for Mason's sake. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. This wasn't about Mason needing another appointment. This was about me needing to see Joseph Cole again, needing to figure out why a simple doctor's visit had left me feeling like I'd been struck by lightning. I set the phone down and leaned back, closing my eyes. 3 years of keeping my head down, focusing only on being a good father, making sure Mason had everything he needed. 3 years of telling myself that I didn't have time for anything else, that wanting something for myself was selfish. And now, because of one kind pediatrician with warm brown eyes and gentle hands, all of that careful control was starting to crumble. The apartment was too quiet. Mason's soft breathing came from his bedroom down the hall, peaceful and steady. I should have been relieved that the appointment went well, should have been proud that Mason had been so brave. And I was. But underneath all of that was something else. Something that scared me because I'd thought I was done with feeling this way. I thought I was done with hope. But sitting there in the dim light of my living room, with the clinic's number saved in my phone and the memory of Joseph's smile burned into my mind, I realized that hope was a stubborn thing. It didn't ask permission. It just showed up, uninvited and overwhelming, and demanded to be felt. I grabbed my phone again and opened the Notes app, typing quickly before I could talk myself out of it. Schedule follow-up appointment for Mason. I stared at those words, knowing they were a lie, knowing exactly what I was doing and why. But I saved the note anyway, because maybe, just maybe, I deserved to feel something good again. Maybe I deserved to see where this strange, unexpected feeling might lead. And if that made me selfish or foolish or both, well, I'd deal with that later. Right now, all I could think about was finding a reason to walk back into that clinic and see Joseph Cole one more time. 1 week. That's how long I lasted before I found myself standing outside the clinic again, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mason held my hand, completely oblivious to the fact that I was using him as an excuse to see someone I couldn't stop thinking about. The guilt sat heavy in my stomach, but not heavy enough to make me turn around and go home. The receptionist looked up when I approached her desk, confusion flickering across her face. She was an older woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and I could tell she was trying to place why I looked familiar. "Can I help you?" "I need to schedule an appointment for my son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. "Walk in, if possible." She clicked through her computer, frowning slightly. "Let me check. Mr. Hayes, correct? But according to our records, your next appointment isn't until next month. Is there an emergency?" The lie came easier than it should have. "Mason's been coughing. Nothing serious probably, but I thought it'd be better to get it checked early rather than wait." I glanced down at Mason, who was currently examining a toy truck in the waiting area with intense concentration, completely healthy and showing zero signs of any cough. In fact, that morning I'd actually coached him to cough a few times before we left the apartment, demonstrating the sound like we were rehearsing for a play. "Just like this, buddy. Remember?" He thought it was a game, coughing dramatically and then giggling. Now he'd apparently forgotten the entire plan. The receptionist gave me a look that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "But she scheduled us anyway. Dr. Cole is running about 15 minutes behind, but he should be able to see Mason shortly." Just hearing his name made my pulse quicken. I nodded my thanks and guided Mason to the seating area, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. What was I doing? This was crazy. I was a grown man, a father, acting like a teenager with a crush. But every time I tried to talk myself into leaving, I'd remember the way Joseph had smiled at Mason, the gentleness in his hands, the brief moment when his eyes had met mine and everything else had faded away. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. I watched other families come and go, kids crying or laughing, parents looking tired or worried or bored. Mason played contentedly with the toys, occasionally looking up to ask me questions about the fish tank in the corner or the posters on the wall. I answered mechanically, my attention focused on the door to the examination rooms. When it finally opened and Joseph stepped out, time seemed to slow down. He wore the same white coat, perfectly fitted across his shoulders, and when he spotted me, his entire face transformed with recognition. That smile, God, that smile was even better than I remembered. It wasn't his professional doctor smile. This was something warmer, something that made heat spread through my chest. "Stephen," he said, and the way he said my name, like he'd been thinking about it, made my breath catch. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." He remembered. Not just my name, but remembered me enough to be surprised by my return. "Yeah, well." I stood up, suddenly aware of how wrinkled my shirt was, how I'd barely looked in the mirror this morning because I'd been too nervous. "Mason's been having some issues." Joseph's expression shifted immediately to concerned doctor mode. as he looked down at Mason. What kind of issues? Coughing. I said the word, feeling hollow in my mouth. Started a few days ago. Joseph nodded and gestured for us to follow him to the examination room. As we walked down the hallway, I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of our footsteps, the smell of antiseptic mixed with something that might have been Joseph's cologne, the way Mason's hand felt small and trusting in mine. Inside the examination room, Joseph lifted Mason onto the table with the same gentle ease he'd shown before. "Hey there, champ. Your dad tells me you've been coughing. Can you show me?" Mason looked at me, confused, having completely forgotten our morning rehearsal. I cleared my throat, meaningfully, trying to give him a hint. He blinked at me, then at Joseph, and finally produced the tiniest, most unconvincing cough I'd ever heard. Joseph's lips twitched like he was trying not to smile. "I see. Well, let's check everything out to be sure." He reached for his stethoscope, then paused and held it out to Gacken instead. "Want to listen to your own heart first? It's pretty cool." Mason's eyes went wide with excitement, and just like that, he was completely absorbed in the game. Joseph placed the stethoscope earpieces carefully in Mason's ears and positioned the other end over his small chest. "Hear that? That's your heart beating. It does that all the time, even when you're sleeping. It's so loud," Mason exclaimed, giggling in that pure delighted way that only children can manage. "Papa, listen. It goes boom boom boom." I found myself smiling despite my nervousness. Watching them interact, Joseph had this incredible gift for making everything feel less scary, less clinical. He made a game out of the examination, letting Mason hold the tongue depressor, explaining each step in a way that transformed potential fear into curiosity. But then Joseph looked up at me and something in his expression changed. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I saw questions there, things unspoken but somehow communicated in that brief connection. "Heart beats for many reasons, buddy," he told Mason, but he was still looking at me, sometimes faster than usual depending on what's happening around us. What did that mean? Was he implying something, or was I reading too much into everything? My mind raced, analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for hidden meanings that might not even exist. The examination concluded with Joseph pronouncing Mason perfectly healthy. "No signs of any respiratory issues," he said, washing his hands at the small sink. "His lungs are clear, throat looks good, no fever." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to me. "But if anything changes, or if you're worried about anything at all, you can call me directly. That's my personal number." I took the card with shaking fingers, feeling the weight of it like it was something much heavier than paper. His personal number, written in his own handwriting across the bottom of the card. This wasn't standard procedure. I knew that much. Doctors didn't usually give out personal numbers to patients' parents. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than intended. "I appreciate you seeing us on such short notice." "Anytime, Stephen," Joseph said softly, and there was something in the way he said it, some quality in his voice that made me think he meant it as more than just a polite courtesy. Anytime at all. 2 weeks later, I'd become that parent. The one the receptionist definitely recognized and probably talked about during lunch breaks. The one who showed up with increasingly ridiculous excuses, each one more transparent than the last. First it was Mason's ear looks a little red, which resulted in a perfectly normal ear examination. Then he's not eating well, despite Mason consuming an entire grilled cheese sandwich in the waiting room. And now, standing at the reception desk for the third time in 14 days, I was about to claim that a mosquito bite needed professional medical attention. The receptionist didn't even try to hide her skepticism this time. She just sighed, typed something into her computer, and told me Dr. Cole would see us shortly. I couldn't even be offended by her obvious judgment because I was too busy judging myself. Late at night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I'd have entire conversations with myself about how insane this behavior was. I was a responsible adult, a single father with a child depending on me, and here I was manufacturing medical emergencies, just to spend 10 minutes in a room with a man who probably saw me as nothing more than an overly anxious parent. But then morning would come and I'd find myself thinking about Joseph's smile, the way his hands had felt when they briefly touched mine, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me, and I'd be back here, inventing new reasons to see him. Today, Mason was building an elaborate tower with blocks in the waiting room, narrating the entire construction process to himself in a running commentary that made other parents smile. He was happy, healthy, completely unaware that his father was using him as an excuse for something that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with loneliness and attraction and hope. When the examination room door opened, Joseph was there, but something was different in his expression. He smiled when he saw me, but it was softer somehow, more knowing. "Stephen," he said. And there was a question in the way he said my name this time. "Back again." "I know," I started, launching into my prepared explanation about the mosquito bite, but Joseph held up his hand gently, stopping me mid-sentence. "Why don't we talk inside?" My stomach dropped. This was it. He was going to tell me to stop wasting his time, to stop making fake appointments, to maybe consider therapy for whatever was clearly going on with me. I followed him into the room, Mason bouncing along beside me, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. Joseph closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he turned his attention to Mason, his professional demeanor sliding into place like a mask. "How about you play with the toys over there, champ? I need to talk to your dad for just a minute." Mason, easily distracted by the bin of toys in the corner, immediately settled in with some toy cars, making engine noises as he rolled them across the floor. Joseph watched him for a moment, a small smile playing at his lips, before turning back to me. That smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "Stephen," he said my name quietly, taking a step closer. Not threatening, not aggressive, just closer. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne. Something clean and subtle that I'd been dreaming about for 2 weeks. "You know you can just call me instead of coming here every few days, right?" The embarrassment was immediate and overwhelming. My face burned hot, and I couldn't meet his eyes anymore. I focused on the anatomy poster behind his shoulder, on the detailed rendering of the human respiratory system, anywhere but his face. Mason, Stephen." The gentle interruption made me look at him, despite myself. His expression wasn't angry or annoyed. If anything, he looked concerned, maybe even a little amused. "Mason is the healthiest kid I've seen this month, possibly the healthiest child in this entire clinic." The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed down on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe. This was the moment where I had to either continue the charade or admit the truth, and I didn't know which option terrified me more. "I know," I finally whispered, still unable to hold his gaze for more than a second at a time. "I know he's fine. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be wasting your time like this, taking up appointment slots that other kids might actually need. It's selfish and stupid, and you're not wasting anything." Joseph moved closer again, and this time I couldn't back away because my legs had forgotten how to move. He was close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that if I just reached out, I could touch him. "But I need you to be honest with me, Stephen. Why are you really here?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. My throat felt desert dry. How could I answer that? How could I explain that he'd awakened something in me I thought had died 3 years ago when Mason's mother walked out? How could I articulate that his kindness to my son had cracked open all the carefully constructed walls I'd built around my heart? "I don't know," I lied, and we both knew it was a lie. Joseph's hand reached out slowly, giving me plenty of time to move away if I wanted to. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm and solid and real. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt infinite, stretching out like they could encompass entire lifetimes. "Then figure it out," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of something I couldn't quite identify. "Because I think you do know, Stephen. I think you know exactly why you're here." He stepped back, breaking the contact, and suddenly I could breathe again, but breathing didn't make things clearer. If anything, the air felt thinner, insufficient. Joseph moved to the door, his hand on the handle, and looked back at me with an expression that was equal parts challenge and invitation. "Take your time," he said, "but when you're ready to be honest, with yourself and with me, you have my number." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in that examination room with Mason's cheerful car noises, providing a soundtrack to my complete emotional breakdown. I stood there frozen, my hand still tingling where he'd touched it, my mind racing through everything that had just happened and everything it might mean. Mason looked up from his toys, innocent and happy. "Papa, can we go get ice cream now?" "Yeah, buddy," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "We can get ice cream." But as we left the clinic, as I buckled Mason into his car seat and drove toward the ice cream shop, all I could think about was Joseph's question hanging unanswered in the air. Why was I really there? And more importantly, was I brave enough to admit the answer? I didn't call him. 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine and deliberate avoidance. Mason went to preschool, played with his friends, came home covered in paint and playground dirt. I went to work, picked him up, made dinner, supervised homework that consisted mostly of coloring inside the lines. We fell back into our normal rhythm, the one we'd perfected over 3 years of being a team of 2. And every single day I told myself that what had happened at the clinic was just a moment of weakness, nothing more. Joseph was a doctor. A professional. Someone who probably dealt with anxious parents all the time and knew exactly how to handle them with kindness and patience. That's all it had been. I was just another single father who'd misread basic human decency as something deeper. The business card with his personal number sat in my wallet, untouched, a constant reminder of my own foolishness. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by staying away. Mason didn't need the complication of me developing feelings for his pediatrician. I didn't need the embarrassment of pursuing something that existed only in my imagination. Better to let it fade, to forget about warm brown eyes and gentle hands and that moment when he'd held my fingers and told me to figure out why I kept coming back. Except I couldn't forget. Late at night, after Mason fell asleep, I'd lie in bed and replay every interaction, analyzing each word and gesture until they lost all meaning. I'd pull out that business card and stare at the handwritten number, my thumb hovering over my phone screen before I'd force myself to put it away. This was better. Safer. Less terrifying than admitting that I wanted something for myself after years of believing I didn't deserve it. Then everything changed on a Tuesday night at 11 o'clock. Mason had been fine at dinner, laughing at my terrible jokes and asking for seconds of spaghetti. Bath time had been normal, bedtime stories completed without issue. But an hour after I'd tucked him in, I heard Rai from his room. Not his usual nightmare cry or his "I need water" cry. This was different, urgent, scared. I rushed to his bedroom and found him sitting up in bed, his small face flushed red and tears streaming down his cheeks. When I pressed my hand to his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin made my stomach drop. He was burning up, his pajamas soaked with sweat, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Mama," he whimpered, and my heart cracked because he only called for his mother when he felt really terrible, when his 3-year-old brain reached for the parent who should have been there but wasn't. "It's okay, buddy." I tried to keep my voice calm even as panic clawed at my chest. "Papa's here. I've got you." I carried him to the bathroom, stripped off his wet pajamas and tried to bring his temperature down with a lukewarm bath while he cried and clung to me. The thermometer read 100 and a third. 100 was too high. Way too high. My hands shook as I dried him off and dressed him in fresh clothes. Back in his room I tried children's fever reducer, but he pushed the medicine away, too miserable to cooperate. He just wanted to be held, so I sat on his bed and pulled him into my lap, feeling helpless and scared and completely out of my depth. This wasn't just a normal fever. Something felt wrong, and I didn't know what to do. That's when I grabbed my phone and without thinking, pulled up Joseph's number. My finger hesitated over the call button for only a second before pressing it. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He probably wouldn't answer. It was 11 at night. He was probably asleep or busy or, "Stephen," his voice was rough with sleep. But the moment he said my name, alert and concerned, something in my chest loosened slightly. "I'm sorry, I know it's late. I shouldn't have called, but Mason has a fever and it's really high and I don't know if I should take him to the emergency room." "What's his temperature?" Joseph's voice shifted immediately into doctor mode, professional and focused. 10-1-3. He won't take medicine. He's been crying and he's so hot. "Listen to me, Stephen. Take a breath." The calmness in his voice cut through my panic. "I'm going to come to you. Can you text me your address?" "What?" "No, Joseph. It's the middle of the night. You don't have to." "Stephen, His tone was firm now, leaving no room for argument. I'm coming. Send me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up before I could protest further. My hands were still shaking as I typed out my address and hit send, then sat there holding Mason and wondering what I'd just done. I'd called him after 2 weeks of avoiding him, of convincing myself to stay away. The moment things got scary, he was the first person I'd reached for. 23 minutes later, I counted every one of them. My doorbell rang. Mason had dozed off against my shoulder, his breathing raspy and uneven. I carried him with me to the door, and when I opened it, Joseph stood there looking nothing like the polished doctor I'd seen at the clinic. His hair was messy, sticking up in places like he'd run his hands through it multiple times. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans instead of his usual professional attire, and he had his medical bag slung over one shoulder. But his eyes were alert and warm and so genuinely concerned that I felt something tight in my chest finally break loose. Where is he? Joseph stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him. I led him to Mason's room and laid my son down on the bed. Joseph immediately went to work, his movements efficient and gentle despite the late hour. He checked Mason's temperature again, examined his throat with a small flashlight, felt the glands in his neck, listened to his breathing. Mason stirred and opened his eyes, recognized Joseph, and actually relaxed a little. Hey there, champ, Joseph said softly. Not feeling so good tonight, huh? Mason shook his head weakly, and Joseph smiled at him with such genuine kindness that I had to look away before I started crying from sheer relief. After several minutes of examination, Joseph straightened up and turned to me. It's viral. Nothing dangerous, just miserable. His throat is inflamed, which is why he doesn't want to take medicine. The fever should break by morning. He pulled a prescription pad from his bag and wrote something down. This is a different type of fever reducer, liquid form that'll be easier on his throat. There's a 24-hour pharmacy about 10 minutes from here. I'll stay with Mason while you go get it. You don't have to do that, I started to say, but Joseph just looked at me with an expression that made my protest die in my throat. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to. So I went to the pharmacy, drove through empty streets at midnight, picked up the medicine, and came back to find Joseph sitting on the floor next to Mason's bed, reading him a story in a low, soothing voice. My son was awake but calm, listening with heavy-lidded eyes. When Mason finally took the medicine without complaint and drifted off to sleep for real this time, Joseph and I moved to the living room. The silence between us felt heavy with everything unsaid over the past 2 weeks. Thank you, I finally managed. You didn't have to come all the way here. Joseph looked at me for a long moment. You've been avoiding me. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly, unable to deny it. I understand why, he continued. What I said at the clinic, pushing you to admit things you weren't ready to face. That wasn't fair. You were right though, I interrupted. About everything. Joseph moved closer, and suddenly we weren't talking about Mason anymore. I've been scared too, Stephen. Scared that I'd completely misread the situation. Scared that what I was feeling was one-sided. My heart hammered against my ribs. It's not. The words hung in the air between us, simple but devastating in their honesty. Joseph's eyes widened slightly, and I saw hope flicker across his face, vulnerable and real. It's not one-sided, I repeated, stronger this time. I've been terrified because I haven't felt this way about anyone since Mason's mother left. And that ended so badly that I convinced myself I was better off alone. And now? Joseph asked quietly. Now I'm still terrified, I admitted. But I'm tired of running from it. I made coffee because I needed something to do with my hands. Something to fill the charged silence that had settled between us after my admission. Joseph accepted the mug I offered him, and we sat down on my worn couch. The same couch where I'd spent countless nights feeding Mason bottles and watching late-night television in those early days of single parenthood. Everything felt different now. The lamp cast soft shadows across the living room, and upstairs Mason slept peacefully, his fever already starting to break. But down here in this small pool of light, Joseph and I were navigating territory that felt both thrilling and dangerous. I owe you an apology, Joseph said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug like he needed its warmth. That day at the clinic, confronting you like that in front of Mason, it was unprofessional. I shook my head. You were being honest. I needed someone to call me out on what I was doing. Maybe, but there were better ways to handle it. He stared down into his coffee. The truth is, I'd been hoping you'd come back. When 2 weeks passed without seeing you, I thought maybe I'd ruined everything by being too direct. The vulnerability in his voice surprised me. This whole time I'd been so focused on my own fears and insecurities that it hadn't occurred to me that Joseph might have been dealing with his own doubts. I spent those 2 weeks trying to convince myself that what I felt was just gratitude, I said. You were kind to Mason, you made him feel safe, and I was just conflating professional competence with something more. That's what I kept telling myself. But Joseph looked up at me, his brown eyes searching. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. The way you smiled. The way you spoke to Mason like he mattered as a person, not just as a patient. The way you looked at me sometimes like you were seeing something I'd forgotten was there. I took a shaky breath. I haven't let myself want anything for so long. It felt safer that way. Easier. And then you showed up and made me remember what it felt like to hope for something more. Joseph set his coffee down on the side table and shifted closer on the couch. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw and the tired lines around his eyes from being woken up in the middle of the night. I noticed you the first time you brought Mason in, he admitted. The way you watched him during the vaccine, making sure he was okay, ready to comfort him if he cried. You have this protective pretentic that's so genuine it made me want to know more about you. And then when you kept coming back with increasingly creative excuses, I realized you might be feeling the same pull I was. The mosquito bite was particularly desperate, I said, and he laughed, a real warm sound that filled the quiet apartment. I almost called you out right then, but I was afraid that if I did, you'd stop coming altogether. He reached over slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to, and placed his head over mine on the couch cushion. I'm a pediatrician because I wanted to make a difference for kids who needed someone to see them, really see them. My own childhood was complicated. I grew up with parents who were physically present but emotionally absent. I learned early on what it felt like to be overlooked. His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, a gesture so gentle it made my throat tight. That's why I became the kind of doctor I am. Why I take time with each kid. Why I try to make them feel heard and valued. Because I know what it's like when nobody does that for you. Mason adores you, I said softly. He talks about you constantly. Dr. Joseph said this and Dr. Joseph did that. You've made such an impact on him. He's an amazing kid, Stephen. And that's entirely because of you and the way you've raised him. Joseph's voice was sincere, without a trace of empty flattery. Single parenting isn't easy. I see a lot of families in my practice, and I can always tell which kids feel secure and loved. Mason is one of those kids. Tears pricked at my eyes unexpectedly. Compliments about my parenting hit differently than any other kind of praise. For 3 years, I'd been second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if I was enough, if Mason would grow up feeling the absence of his mother, if my love alone could be sufficient. I worry all the time that I'm screwing him up, I confessed, that he needs more than what I can give him. His mother left when he was so young that he doesn't even remember her, and sometimes I wonder if that's better or worse. You're not screwing him up, Joseph said firmly. You're giving him stability and love and attention. Those are the things that matter most. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still touching, the weight of our confessions settling around us. I studied his face in the lamplight, memorizing the details I'd only allowed myself to glance at before. The curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the kindness in his expression that wasn't performative but genuine. What happens now? I asked quietly. With us? Joseph considered the question carefully. What do you want to happen? I want to stop being afraid, I said. I want to see where this could go without constantly sabotaging it because I'm scared of getting hurt again. I can't promise you won't get hurt, Joseph said honestly. Relationships are complicated, and there's always risk involved. But I can promise that I'm not interested in playing games or wasting your time. I like you, Stephen. I want to get to know you better. Not as Mason's father, but as yourself. My heart was racing now. That familiar mixture of excitement and terror that came with standing on the edge of something new and uncertain. I want that too, Joseph smiled, and it transformed his entire face. So we take it slow. We figure this out together. No fake appointments needed. Just honest conversations and seeing what develops naturally. Slow sounds good, I agreed, even though part of me wanted to rush headlong into whatever this was becoming. But I had Mason to think about, and bringing someone new into his life required caution and careful consideration. Can I ask you something? Joseph's expression turned serious again. Anything. That night, when you called me, why did you call me instead of taking Mason to the emergency room? Or calling your regular pediatrician's after-hours line? I thought about lying, about making up some excuse about his number being convenient or his clinic being closer. But we just agreed to honesty, and I owed him that much. Because you were the person I trusted most when I was scared. Because even though I'd been avoiding you, some part of me knew you'd answer and you'd help and you'd make everything feel less terrifying. I met his eyes. Because you're the first person I've wanted to lean on in 3 years. Joseph's breath caught audibly. He lifted his free hand and cupped my face gently, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. Can I kiss you? The question hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then I nodded, unable to form words. He leaned in slowly, carefully, giving me every opportunity to change my mind. When his lips finally met mine, it was soft and tentative and perfect. Nothing rushed or demanding, just a gentle exploration that sent warmth flooding through my entire body. His hand was still against my face, steady and reassuring, and I realized I was gripping his hoodie with my free hand, holding on like he might disappear if I let go. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing harder. Joseph rested his forehead against mine and I could feel him smiling. So, he whispered, definitely no more fake appointments? I laughed, the sound catching in my throat. Definitely not. This is much better than inventing symptoms. Agreed, he murmured and kissed me again. Our first official date happened on a Saturday afternoon at a small cafe downtown that Joseph had suggested. It was the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, quiet enough for conversation but busy enough that we didn't feel conspicuous. Mason sat between us with his coloring book spread across the table, completely absorbed in adding purple stripes to what might have been a dinosaur or possibly a dragon. With 3-year-old art, it was hard to tell. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since my very first date back in high school. My palms were sweaty and I'd changed my shirt 3 times before leaving the apartment, trying to find something that looked casual but not sloppy, put together but not like I was trying too hard. Eventually I'd settled on a simple button-down and jeans, and now I was second-guessing that choice as I sat across from Joseph, who looked effortlessly good in a gray sweater that brought out the warmth in his eyes. So, Joseph said, wrapping his hands around his latte, tell me something about yourself that I wouldn't learn from Mason's medical file. The request caught me off guard. After weeks of our interactions being filtered through medical appointments and parental concerns, the idea of talking about myself as just myself felt strange and vulnerable. I'm not sure where to start, I admitted. It's been a long time since anyone asked about me instead of about being Mason's dad. Start anywhere, Joseph encouraged. What did you do before Mason was born? What were your plans? I took a sip of my coffee, gathering my thoughts. I was in graduate school, actually, working on a master's degree in architecture. I'd always been fascinated by buildings, by the way spaces could be to make people feel certain things. I wanted to create places where people felt comfortable, safe, at home. That's beautiful, Joseph said, genuine interest in his voice. Did you finish the program? I shook my head. Mason's mother got pregnant during my final year. We weren't married, barely even serious, but we decided to try making it work. She left 6 months after he was born, said she couldn't handle the responsibility, and suddenly I was a single father trying to finish a thesis while taking care of an infant who barely slept. I smiled, but it felt sad around the edges. Architecture school isn't exactly compatible with solo parenting a newborn. I had to drop out. Do you regret it? The question wasn't judgmental, just curious. Sometimes, I answered honestly. Late at night when Mason's asleep and the apartment is quiet, I think about the buildings I could have designed, the career I could have had. But then I wake up in the morning and Mason crawls into bed with me and asks what we're having for breakfast, and I remember that I wouldn't trade him for anything, not even my dreams. Joseph reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. That's not settling, Stephen. That's choosing what matters most. What about you? I asked, wanting to shift the focus away from my own complicated past. You mentioned your childhood was difficult. Is that what led you to pediatrics? Joseph's expression shifted, becoming more contemplative. My parents were both successful business people, always traveling, always working. They provided everything material but nothing emotional. I spent most of my childhood being raised by nannies and babysitters who changed every few months. There was no consistency, no one who really knew me or cared about what I was feeling. He paused, watching Mason color with intense focus. I remember going to the doctor once when I was about 6. I had strep throat and felt miserable, and this pediatrician, Dr. Martinez, she took the time to actually talk to me, asked me about school, about what I like to do, made me feel like I mattered as a person and not just as a patient with a sore throat. That 20-minute appointment stuck with me for years. So you became the doctor you needed when you were a kid, I said, understanding clicking into place. Exactly. I wanted to be the person who sees children as whole people, not just collections of symptoms. Kids pick up on when adults are being genuine with them. They know when someone truly cares, versus when someone is just going through the motions. That's why Mason responded to you so quickly, I realized. He could tell you were real. Joseph smiled. Mason's perceptive. Most kids are. More than adults give them credit for. As if on cue, Mason looked up from his coloring book, his face serious. Papa, is Dr. Joseph your special friend now? The question was so direct and innocent that both Joseph and I froze for a moment. I'd been wondering when Mason would start asking questions about why his pediatrician was suddenly joining us for coffee and spending time at our apartments. 3-year-olds were surprisingly observant. Would that be okay with you, buddy? I asked carefully, wanting to gauge his reaction before committing to an answer. Mason considered this with the gravity of someone making a life-altering decision. Then he nodded firmly. Dr. Joseph is nice. He doesn't make shots hurt, and he reads good stories. Joseph laughed, the sound warm and genuine. That's the highest praise I could ask for. So yes, I told Mason, then looked at Joseph with a smile that felt both nervous and hopeful. Dr. Joseph is my special friend. Best friends? Mason asked, using his favorite designation for anyone he liked. Even better than best friends, Joseph said, winking at him. Mason seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to his coloring, adding green stars to the margins of his page. But I caught the look Joseph gave me across the table, soft and meaningful and full of promise. We spent another hour at the cafe, talking about everything and nothing. Joseph told me about his apartment across town, about the collection of vintage medical books he'd been slowly accumulating, about his terrible attempts at learning to cook. I talked about Mason's preschool adventures, about the architecture podcasts I still listen to sometimes when I felt nostalgic, about my modest dreams of maybe taking online classes eventually when Mason was older. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, without the awkwardness I'd feared. Joseph was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in everything I said, asking follow-up questions that showed he was really listening. And when Mason demanded Joseph's help with coloring a particularly tricky section of his picture, Joseph dove in with enthusiasm, offering advice on color choices with complete seriousness. Watching them together, Joseph's dark head bent close to Mason's lighter one. Both of them focused intently on staying inside the lines. Something settled in my chest. This felt right. Comfortable. Like pieces fitting together that I hadn't even realized were misaligned. When we finally left the cafe, the autumn air was crisp and perfect. Joseph walked us to my car, his hand brushing against mine as we moved through the parking lot. Mason ran ahead, playing some game that involved jumping over cracks in the pavement. At my car, Joseph caught my hand fully, threading his fingers through mine. This was nice, he said. Can we do it again? I'd like that, I replied, surprised by how much I meant it. Dating had always felt like something obligatory before. Something I did because it was expected. But this was different. This felt like something I wanted, something I was choosing for myself. Joseph glanced toward where Mason was now attempting to climb onto a decorative boulder near the parking lot entrance. I should let you wrangle him before he decides that's a mountain that needs conquering. Probably wise. I agreed, but neither of us moved immediately. Then Joseph leaned in, quick and gentle, and pressed a kiss to my cheek. It was brief, appropriate given that we were in public with my son nearby, but it sent warmth spreading through me nonetheless. Text me when you get home? He asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. He squeezed my hand once more before letting go and stepping back, that familiar warm smile on his face. As I buckled Mason into his car seat and drove home through the Saturday afternoon traffic, I caught myself smiling for no reason. Mason chattered about his coloring masterpiece and asked if Dr. Joseph could come to our apartment again soon, and I answered in vague affirmatives while my mind replayed every moment of the past few hours. That night, after Mason fell asleep, clutching the dinosaur dragon picture he'd colored, I stood on my small balcony looking up at the stars. The city light pollution made them faint, but they were there if you looked hard enough. I pulled out my phone and opened the message thread with Joseph, typing out a simple text. Made it home safely. Mason wants to know when you're visiting again. His response came almost immediately. Whenever you want me there. I smiled at the screen, feeling something warm and hopeful unfurling in my chest. For 3 years I'd been focused solely on survival, getting through each day, making sure Mason had what he needed, keeping our small family unit functioning. I'd stopped thinking about possibilities beyond our routine, stopped imagining that life could hold anything more than the responsibilities I'd accepted. But standing there under the faint stars, my son sleeping peacefully inside and Joseph's words glowing on my phone screen, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again, to hope again, to believe that maybe I deserved happiness too. And it had all started with something so simple. Mason's laugh in a doctor's office. A moment of connection I'd almost been too scared to acknowledge. Sometimes the most ordinary moments turned out to be the ones that changed everything. Sometimes you just had to be brave enough to recognize them when they appeared and courageous enough to see where they might lead. I sent one more text before heading inside. Tomorrow afternoon work for you. Mason's requesting a rematch in coloring. Joseph's reply made me laugh. I'll bring my best crayons. Prepare to be defeated. Tomorrow, I thought, heading back inside to my quiet apartment. Tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, stretching out ahead of us like possibilities waiting to be explored.